John Tooby and Tooby Cosmides have called the traditional non-evolutionary social science approach the Standard Social Science Model, or SSSM. The SSSM makes the following assumptions about human behavior and culture. Humans are born as blank slates, such that knowledge, personality traits, and cultural values are acquired from the cultural environment. Human behavior is infinitely malleable through learning, and there are no biological constraints on how people turn out. Human behavior is determined by a process of learning, socialization, or indoctrination. Culture is an autonomous force and exists independently of people. Learning processes are general in that they can be applied to a variety of phenomena. The same processes underlie mate selection, for example, as underlie food selection. The establishment of the SSSM can be seen, at least in part, as a reaction to some of the more extreme claims of the biological determinists of the late 19th and early 20th century. Many took Darwin's theories and used them to demonstrate that certain races were less highly evolved than others, requiring individuals to spot missing components from gramophones and tennis courts, ensuring low scores. Eugenicists and their kind used the results of such research to recommend all manner of atrocities, such as forced sterilization based on the premise that other races and cultures were not so highly evolved and therefore wouldn't feel pain in the same way that the more evolved Western people would. This is a profound misunderstanding of Darwin's ideas. The notion that some organisms are more evolved than others and therefore more important in some moral way dates back to Aristotle and the Great Chain of Being. Darwinian thinking explicitly denies such a notion. Humans are not descended from chimpanzees as is commonly thought. Rather, chimpanzees and humans are both descended from a common ancestor. It is all too easy to believe that a chimpanzee is simply a more primitive version of a human, stripped of the bells and whistles that constitute humanity. On the contrary, chimpanzees, by virtue of the nature of their evolutionary trajectory, have their own particular adaptations that we do not. As an analogy, the railway train and the automobile share a common ancestor, the horse-drawn cart. It makes no sense to assume that a car is a more sophisticated railway train, or vice versa, since each has its own specific adaptations to suit the purpose for which it was designed. The founder of what was to become cultural relativism was the anthropologist Franz Boas. Boas argued that many differences between people were due to differences in their culture, and if one wished to understand people, one must necessarily understand their culture. This represented a step change in the social sciences that is still of great importance today. No longer do we assume that, for instance, working-class people speak differently from the middle and upper-class people because they are biologically inferior. We know now that it is an effect of culture. From these honorable beginnings, cultural relativism dominated thinking, to the extent that many social scientists developed an almost pathological fear of biological explanations of human behavior, a disposition that sociologist Lee Ellis termed bio-phobia. There are various reasons for this. One reason is that once a scientific paradigm is established, it is difficult for researchers to consider alternative explanations. Specifically, it's less acceptable for them to consider ideas that lie outside their current paradigm, as they are seen as old ways of thinking. Another reason is that the eugenic atrocities of the Second World War made people fearful of censure. Advancing explanations based on human nature was seen as advocating genetic determinism and eugenics. Like all scientific endeavors, sociobiology and evolutionary psychology have both attracted a good deal of criticism. Unlike most scientific disciplines, a great deal of this has been from outside the scientific community. Sociobiology was seen by many as promulgating dangerous forms of thinking, such as eugenics or supporting racist and sexist ideologies. In 1984, a poster was produced requesting protesters to bring noisemakers to a public lecture, which was to be given by Edward O. Wilson, who was denounced as the prophet of the right-wing patriarchy. At the 1978 meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, Wilson was met with vocal opposition. Demonstrators chanted, "Racist Wilson, you can't hide. We charge you with genocide." Within the academic community, Wilson's own Harvard colleagues Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Lewontin were members of the Sociobiology study group who criticized sociobiology on scientific and ethical grounds. In 1986, a group of 20 social scientists, including the Cambridge ethologist Robert Hinn, the psychologist David Adams, and paleoanthropologist Richard Leakey, drafted what was to become known as the Seville Statement on Violence. This document attempts to refute the link posed by sociobiologists and evolutionary psychologists between biology and violent behavior, particularly war. The following are its main propositions. It is scientifically incorrect to say that we have inherited a tendency to make war from our animal ancestors. It is scientifically incorrect to say that war on any other violent behavior is genetically programmed into our nature. It is scientifically incorrect to say that in human evolution there has been a selection for aggressive behavior more than for other kinds of behavior. It is scientifically incorrect to say that humans have a violent brain. How we act is shaped by how we have been conditioned and socialized. There is nothing in our neurophysiology that compels us to react violently. It is scientifically incorrect to say that war is caused by instinct or any single motivation. Although the Seville Statement on Violence was adopted by UNESCO and the American Psychological Association as a statement of contemporary research on the relationship between biology and violence, it has also attracted much criticism. It has been suggested that few scientists would advocate the claims it attempts to rebut. So, in many ways, the Seville Statement on Violence is totally uncontroversial. More problematic, however, is not what it actually states, but what it has been taken to mean. For example, humanitarian organizations claim that the Seville Statement on Violence refuted the link between genetics and violence based on scientific evidence. But this cannot be the case because there is no good evidence that comes close to refuting such a connection. On the other hand, it might simply mean that a link between biology and violence has not yet been proved beyond any reasonable doubt. Some researchers have proposed that the statement is a political rather than a scientific one. It is some value in dampening down the enthusiasm of some of the more over-enthusiastic adherents to biological determinism. However, it also does a disservice in making it appear that the science has disproved what it patently has not. Despite the misgivings of the social scientists outside psychology, Darwinian thinking was alive and well in disciplines such as ethology and behavioral ecology. But the orthodoxy within psychology was still cultural relativism. Even psychologists who studied animal behavior, where Darwinism can be least controversially applied, tended to ignore species-specific behavior. Learning theorists such as Pavlov, Watson, and Skinner were concerned with studying the general mechanisms of learning, using the principles of classical and operant conditioning. This framework viewed human beings basically as more complex versions of rats, pigeons, and sea slugs, and proposed that if we could understand these simpler organisms, then we could scale up the findings to understand humans. Two researchers engaged in this enterprise, Keller and Marion Brelin. They found that animals' instinctive behavior kept getting in the way of the supposedly species' general processes of association and reinforcement. Using Skinnerian methods, they were engaged in training animals for the advertising industry, teaching different animals to put dollars in piggy banks, for example. What they found was that despite their best efforts, the animals kept reverting to instinctive behaviors instead of depositing them in the container as required. Pigs attempted to root the dollars with their snouts, which is a natural pig behavior, whereas raccoons would rub the coins together in an instinctive food washing behavior. They reported that there seems to be a continuing realization by psychologists that perhaps the white rat cannot reveal everything there is to know about behavior, suggesting that learning is constrained by species-specific instincts. It would be incorrect to attribute the failure of psychology to embrace Darwin solely to the political correctness of the dominant cultural relativist school. Psychologists have tended to focus on proximate questions such as how do people form impressions of other people, or how does memory work, or what risk factors are important in the development of eating disorders, rather than the ultimate questions for which a Darwinian framework is best suited. Given the types of questions that concern psychologists, cultural relativism, or SSSM, provided a perfectly workable framework. Unlike biologists who study animal behavior for whom Darwin is indispensable, psychologists could do without him. Freud is an interesting case in the history of psychology. To many, he is the embodiment of cultural relativism, with the great emphasis he placed on the role of the parents and family in the shaping of an individual's personality. However, Freud deserves mention for two reasons. First, unlike many subsequent psychologists, Freud was interested in ultimate questions. He was preoccupied with finding out why people behaved as they did, not simply how. Although many of these accounts were distinctly non-Darwinian, such as the Oedipus complex in which a male child desires to kill his father, some of his ideas are much more in line with recent Darwinian psychology. For example, Freud's notion of the id as a set of inborn desires, including the sexual imperative, which has many parallels with evolutionary theory, and his view that our conscious selves might be completely unaware of our real motives is echoed in Robert Trivers' theory of self-deception. Freud wrote, and paid close attention to the similarity to the ideas of Dawkins' selfish gene theory, that the individual himself regards sexuality as one of his own ends, whereas from another point of view, he is an appendage to his germplasm, at whose disposal he puts his energies in return for the bonus of pleasure. He is the mortal vehicle of an immortal substance, like the inheritor of an entailed property, passed through generations, who is only the temporary holder of an estate that survives him. The first serious attempt to apply evolutionary thinking to psychology was led by Harvard zoologist E.O. Wilson with the publication in 1975 of Sociobiology, The New Synthesis. This book laid the foundations for the modern evolutionary approach to the study of behavior. Like ethology and behavioral ecology, sociobiology developed as a branch of biology rather than of the social sciences, and was defined by Wilson as the systematic study of the biological basis of all social behavior. To a materialist, all social behavior has its roots in biological functioning, in the sense that social behavior is ultimately due to brain activity. But Wilson meant more than this. He argued that if behavior affected reproductive success in a predictable way, and if particular behaviors are influenced by genes, then natural selection would, to some extent, have shaped human behavior. Sociobiology suffered a fair amount of controversy, and for this reason many, including Dawkins and Wilson himself, have suggested that evolutionary psychology is simply sociobiology rebranded to make it more politically palatable. But there are some differences between sociobiology and what is now known as evolutionary psychology, although whether these differences are so great as to warrant a name change is up for debate. The term evolutionary psychology was coined by a group of UC Santa Barbara led by John Tooby and Tooby Cosmides. If evolutionary psychology has a birthday, it is in 1992, when together with Jerome Barkow they published The Adapted Mind, a collection of articles by multiple authors. This highly influential book acted as the foundation for much of what was to come later. Tooby and Cosmides proposed that evolutionary psychology differs from sociobiology and that the former adopts a cognitive level of explanation. Evolutionary psychologists, unlike sociobiologists, attempt to explain human behavior in terms of the underlying computations that occur within the mind. This meant that evolutionary psychologists could study phenomena traditionally dominated by cognitive psychologists, such as memory, reasoning, and perception, as well as phenomena entertained by sociobiologists, such as mate choice, parent-offspring conflict, and foraging behavior. Evolutionary psychology was now squarely in the center ground of psychology and was hard to ignore. Tooby and Cosmides, who were responsible for the synthesis of adaptation and modularity, outlined 5 principles that defined evolutionary psychology. The brain is a physical system which functions as a computer. Its circuits are designed to generate behavior that is appropriate for our environmental circumstances. Our neural circuits were designed by natural selection to solve problems that our ancestors faced during our species' evolutionary history. Consciousness is just the tip of the iceberg. Most of what goes on in our minds is hidden from us. As a result, our conscious experience can mislead us into thinking that our circuitry is simpler than it really is. Most problems that we experience as easy to solve are in fact very difficult to solve. They require very complicated neural circuitry. Different neural circuits are specialized for solving different adaptive problems. Our modern skulls house a Stone Age mind. Of these 5 principles, number 1 and 3 are standard assumptions taken from cognitive psychology, and principle 2 is made by sociobiology. The principles that are unique to the Santa Barbara School are principle 4, which is modularity, and principle 5, which implies that behaviors that were adaptive in the past could be maladaptive nowadays. Both of these, however, have proved to be controversial. Let's hear some of the ideas of UCSB's Tooby Cosmides and John Tooby about evolutionary psychology.
Today we're talking with John Tooby and Tooby Cosmides of UC Santa Barbara. Thanks for talking to us. You guys are central to evolutionary discussions of things like anthropology, psychology, applications of evolutionary theory to all aspects of human existence. What's the primary insight that an evolutionary approach brings to the table?
We're particularly associated with evolutionary psychology, but that connects to all of the social sciences and humanities. Because theories about the design of the human mind are central to all of those areas.
One of the primary differences is the traditional worldview was the mind was something like a tape recorder or a blank slate general learning system, and the model of human nature was we're just a passive receptacle, and culture and our environment is downloaded into us without the mechanisms of the mind inscribing a particular content of their own.
So we're asking the question, what kinds of adaptive problems were our hunter-gatherer ancestors? What kinds of problems did they have to solve well in order to survive and reproduce in those environments? And what kinds of cognitive mechanisms would be well designed for solving them? Because that gives you insights into what to look for in the human mind. The key thing that changes it from other approaches to psychology is instead of looking at the mind as a blank slate, we see the mind as full of very interesting, reliably developing programs, species-typical programs that guide our behavior. Evolutionary psychology focuses on that intermediate step of what's the structure of those programs. And without understanding that, all you can have is sort of fuzzy relationships between insights about selection pressures and behavior as opposed to a real science of the mind.
Modularity, the idea that the brain is composed of multiple modular organs, each with a different behavioral or cognitive function, has a long and colorful history in psychology. The phrenology of Franz Joseph Gall was, in essence, a modular psychological theory. Gall's theory proposed that the mind is made up of specific mental organs or faculties, each being responsible for some aspect of behavior. Gall proposed in the region of 37 different faculties, plus a few subfaculties, each of which is localized in a particular part of the brain. Some of these organs had romantic names and exotic functions, such as philoprogenitiveness, meaning parental love, or approbativeness, the desire for praise, and alimentiveness, related to appreciation of food and drink. Other organs were concerned with more prosaic tasks, such as the perception of causality and time. The bumps that naturally occur on the cranium were thought to be indicative of these underlying organs, and phrenologists believed that you could read a person's characteristics by feeling the size of these bumps. While the specifics of phrenology had long been discredited, the idea that we might have mental faculties for specific behaviors endures due to philosopher Jerry Fodor and evolutionary psychologists such as Tooby and Cosmides. The Modularity of the Mind by philosopher Jerry Fodor was published in 1983. A slim volume of only 145 pages, its small size belied the impact it would have on the cognitive sciences. And a panel of cognitive scientists recently voted it the 7th most influential work of cognitive science in the 20th century. Fodor's claim was that the mind was best thought of as being composed of mental modules, each of which was responsible for a certain aspect of human behavior. For example, we might have a mental module that was responsible for the perception of human faces, a separate module for processing language, and so on. Moreover, Fodor argued that these modules were innate and changed little over our lifetime. This notion was and still is controversial, because many cognitive scientists saw the mind as being a large, general-purpose computer with little innate knowledge and certainly no innate modules. Tooby and Cosmides saw the evolutionary logic in Fodor's proposition. They argued that when faced with a problem, natural selection tends to produce specific solutions. Thus, our heart pumps blood, which is filtered by our kidneys and is sent to the lungs for a gaseous exchange. Each bodily organ has one or only a few specific roles to play. Thus, natural selection's usual MO does not tally with the claim that the mind is a vast general-purpose computing device. A common criticism of modularity is that there is very little neurological evidence for mental modules in the neocortex, the part of the brain that is most closely associated with the behavior of higher primates in general and humans in particular. In their classic paper, The Spandrels of San Marco, Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Lewontin leveled two criticisms at evolutionary theories of human behavior. First, they argued that many evolutionists are too keen to see behaviors as being adaptive. They lampooned this tendency with reference to Voltaire's Dr. Pangloss from Candide, who saw everything as being for the best. Observe, for instance, the nose is formed for spectacles, therefore we wear spectacles. Second, they suggested that the adaptive explanations provided are frequently unsupported by any evidence, and because so little is known about our hunter-gatherer ancestors, it might be impossible to obtain any such evidence. This being the case, they suggest adaptive arguments might be little better than Rudyard Kipling's whimsical just-so stories, which, for example, claim that the elephant got its trunk as a result of an ancestor getting its nose stretched in a tussle with a crocodile. In the spirit of just-so stories, neuroscientist V.S. Ramachandran published a paper claiming that males prefer blonde females because, among other things, their lighter skin makes it more obvious if they are infested with parasites. Ramachandran later claimed that the article was a hoax designed to reveal the speculative nature of evolutionary thinking. It is important to both sexes that they choose mates of high quality, and parasite infestation is likely to reduce the ability of a female to produce and rear offspring. His theory was intended to be a just-so story. Ramachandran's article's central argument, although speculative, is far from being total nonsense. Parasites are extremely debilitating and can severely lower an individual's fitness. Hence, it makes sense for a male or female to attend to signals that might indicate the presence of parasites in a potential mate. It has been argued that adornments, such as the peacock's tail, might be present to indicate to a mate that its owner is relatively free from parasites. Taken together, these 2 points show that Ramachandran's hoax was nothing like that produced by physicist Alan Sokal. Sokal famously and deliberately set out to show the muddled thinking of cultural studies theorists by having a paper accepted by the journal Social Text. His paper, Transgressing the Boundaries Towards a Transformative Hermeneutics of Quantum Theory, was, as the title suggests, nonsense, and this time was reviewed by experts in the field of cultural studies. So how can evolutionary psychologists ensure that their research is not mere fantasy? There are a number of methods in addition to the usual ones used by psychologists to evaluate their theories. One is to use research methods from behavioral genetics, which attempt to separate out the effects of genes and the environment by conducting twin and adoption studies. One of the assumptions of this type of research is that because identical twins are genetically identical, any differences between them must be due to the environment. By comparing identical twins to non-identical twins and non-twin siblings, behavioral geneticists have been able to estimate the extent to which genes are implicated in a wide range of traits and behaviors such as intelligence, personality, obesity, addictive behaviors, and so on. Although behavioral genetics research determines if a particular trait is genetically influenced, it does not tell us whether that trait is an adaptation. A second method, the comparative method, attempts to address more directly the problem of adaptation. Humans are under similar economic pressures to many other animals. Each needs to find and consume food, find a mate, rear offspring, and so on. It is therefore likely that similarities exist between human and non-human species in terms of the way that they solve these particular problems. This is especially the case for our closest relatives among the apes. Therefore, one way of testing an evolutionary theory is to look for analogs in primates and other species. Testing whether particular behaviors are adaptive is more easily done for non-human animals than it is for humans, as it can be assumed that the animals are living under similar conditions to their ancestors. Thus, evolutionists are able to observe certain traits and test whether, on average, they lead the individual to produce more surviving offspring. Another method seeks cross-cultural evidence. If a particular trait is supposed to be adaptive, then we might expect to find it in all people irrespective of the particulars of their culture. With respect to Ramachandran's question, is the preference for blonde hair, light skin found in all cultures, or are the gentlemen who prefer blondes found only in Western society? Finding that a trait is universal might again suggest that it is innate and therefore possibly a biological adaptation. However, this simple state of affairs is complicated because some evolved and adaptive behaviors are environmentally contingent. That is, they only arise under certain circumstances. A special type of cross-cultural research therefore looks at evidence from the dwindling numbers of hunter-gatherer communities that still exist across the world. The reasoning is that these societies are living under conditions more similar to those that our ancestors experienced than those in the industrialized world. Here we might determine whether a particular behavior actually does seem to have fitness consequences in terms of them producing more surviving offspring. This type of study is still not without controversy because contemporary hunter-gatherer people are not merely historical relics, but have developed sophisticated cultures over the hundreds of thousands of years since mankind's putative evolutionary environment. The fourth method is that of mathematical and computational modeling. In this method, researchers create an abstract world in which individuals with particular traits compete with each other for dominance. This gives researchers some idea as to which particular traits or combinations of traits are optimal and how different traits might interact with each other. One result from this work is that the success of a particular trait might be relative rather than absolute. This means that having a particular trait or behaving in a particular way might depend on what other traits are around in the environment and what other people do. For example, mooching off of other people without reciprocating can be a very successful strategy for an individual, but only if the number of moochers is small. As the number of moochers increases, cooperators refuse to engage in social exchange or become more wary, making mooching an inefficient strategy. Critics point out that we know very little about the lives of our ancestors. However, we do know some things about our ancestors based on surviving fossils and artifacts, such as that they lived in groups rather than alone, that they hunted and gathered and, later, engaged in primitive agriculture, that they practiced sexual reproduction and prolonged child rearing, that they fashioned tools and weaponry, had rituals such as burial of the dead, wore clothing and ornamentation, and so on. Evolutionary thinking can be useful even if we know little about the evolutionary history of a trait. For example, take two facts about bipolar disorder. First, it is a debilitating disease that appears to reduce fitness, in some cases resulting in suicide. Second, it is heritable. Only with knowledge of natural selection can we see that these two statements lead to a contradiction. If something is heritable and harmful, it should be selected out of the gene pool. The fact that it is still with us suggests that it has some hidden benefits to inclusive fitness that outweigh its obvious costs. Evolutionary thinking can therefore point out new and interesting questions for future research. Like sociobiology before it, evolutionary psychology has attracted a fair degree of criticism over the years, some of which is valid, some of which appears to be the result of common misunderstandings. Next, we cover some of the most common criticisms with the aim of correcting some of the misconceptions. First, it is worth spending some time discussing the nature of adaptation. Many evolutionary biologists hold that adaptation is a process rather than a thing, and recommend the phrase adaptive trait to discuss a physical or behavioral trait. So adaptation is a process whereby a trait changes through the process of natural selection so that it functions more effectively in the current environment. Some of these cases are relatively clear-cut, such as a fish's tail fins are therefore adapted for swimming, a bird's wings adapted for flying, and so on. But in many cases, it is not at all clear whether a given trait is an adaptation or not. An equally important question is, if a given trait is an adaptation, then what is its purpose? There is no designer that we can ask. So the ultimate arbiter as to what a trait is for is whether it causes the organism to leave behind more copies of its genes. From this view, child care could be seen as an adaptation for ensuring that copies of your genes can survive in the vessel of another person, your child. But many other traits are not adapted but are side effects of the way that the body was put together. A classic example is the recurrent laryngeal nerve that carries signals from the brain to the muscles of the neck, a distance of a few centimeters in most mammals. In some species, however, it descends from the brain down to the heart, where it loops around the aorta and then returns back up. It is clear that taking this scenic route serves no useful purpose, so it is not an adaptation, but a side effect of the way that bodies evolved over history. It is often said that evolutionary psychologists see all behaviors as adaptations. And it is true that thinking of the adaptive consequences of heritable traits and behaviors is a central part of evolutionary psychology. But there are many behaviors and traits that evolutionary psychologists believe are not adaptations. A fact that is often overlooked by critics is that not all evolutionary psychologists speak with the same voice. In any academic discipline, there are disagreements, and evolutionary psychologists differ as to whether a given behavior is adaptive, non-adaptive, or the side effect of some other adaptation. For example, in their book on rape, co-authors Randy Thornhill and Craig Palmer disagree as to whether rape is a direct adaptation, or whether it is a side effect of the male's adaptation to pursue sex. Jordania argues that music is an adaptation concerned with predator control, whereas Steven Pinker argues that although music and other arts are found in all cultures, they are byproducts of adaptations, not adaptations themselves, suggesting music is a side effect of language processing adaptations, and many visual aesthetic preferences are byproducts of adaptation for habitat selection. Many critics have accused evolutionary psychology and sociobiology of genetic determinism, of suggesting that everything about humans, our intelligence, personalities, and sexual proclivities, is specified in our genes. This is simply not the case, as evolutionists are at pains to emphasize the importance of the environment and culture in making us who we are. When evolutionary psychologists discuss the effect of genes on psychology, they think in terms of predispositions rather than causes. Genes do not cause men to commit violent acts. If they do anything, they predispose men to such acts. Whether men actually carry them out will depend on their life histories, cultural contexts, and other genetic predispositions, such as conscience. This last point is an important one. Critics inevitably focus on the nasty side of evolutionary psychology, rape, war, infanticide, and so on, and rarely discuss the fact that evolutionists also propose predispositions for cooperation, conflict resolution, parental investment, romantic love, morality, and altruism. Reductionism is a dirty word in many circles, but in fact, it is one of the most important inventions in the history of science. Reductionism is simply the explanation of some property or behavior in terms of simpler, more basic mechanisms, and its application is what led human beings to discover that matter is made of atoms, or that complex life was produced by natural selection. In his book Darwin's Dangerous Idea, philosopher Daniel Dennett distinguishes between good reductionism and greedy reductionism. In good reductionism, phenomena are explained at lower levels but do not replace higher levels. Rather, researchers from different disciplines work together to understand phenomena at all levels. Greedy reductionism avoids higher levels and attempts to explain everything in terms of the lowest possible level. For example, we know that depression is manifested in terms of abnormal functioning in the brain, and studying the brains of people with depression has led to many useful insights about the nature of this illness. But it doesn't tell the whole story. We also know that life events such as bereavement or unemployment can trigger episodes of depression, and this cannot be determined by looking only at brains. Good reductionism seeks lower levels of explanation, but does not ignore the contributions of higher levels. So researchers should work together, psychologists investigating the environmental components of depression and neuroscientists investigating brain functioning, with results of all researchers being combined to form the big picture of depression. While there are barriers to this utopian view, which E.O. Wilson calls consilience, interdisciplinary research groups are certainly becoming more prevalent in the world's universities. Many have criticized evolutionary psychology for promulgating conservative, ethnocentric, or sexist accounts of human behavior. Natalie Angier, an evolutionary biologist, argues that evolutionary psychology, as it has been disseminated across mainstream consciousness, is a cranky and despotic cyclops. Its single eye glaring through an overwhelmingly masculinist lens. I say masculinist rather than male, because the view of male behavior promulgated by hardcore evolutionary psychologists is as narrow and inflexible as their view of womanhood is. First of all, it's worth pointing out that most of the criticisms of evolutionary psychology focus on the mate choice literature. In fact, to many people, the work on sex differences in mate choice is evolutionary psychology. This is largely because this is the kind of stuff that gets in the newspapers. Second, even within the mate choice literature, this is only one theory, although admittedly the most prominent theory. The success of evolutionary psychology should not be evaluated by the success of one particular theory in one particular topic area, but there is a deeper concern. If it is conclusively demonstrated that males and females are fundamentally genetically different, then could this have effects on public policy? Should we forgive men's philandering because it is in their genes? If, as Thornhill and Palmer assert, rape could be an effective reproductive strategy, should we be more lenient on rapists because they can't help it? There are three main responses to this question. The first is to appeal to a philosophical principle known as the naturalistic fallacy. To commit the naturalistic fallacy is to assume that because something is found in nature, it is necessarily good or desirable in some kind of moral sense. Equating natural with good and unnatural with bad is fallacious. Many natural things are, from our perspective, bad, such as tornadoes, cobra venom, and cyanide. On the other hand, many unnatural things can be good, such as medicine, electric guitars, and red wine. Just because something is natural does not necessarily mean that it is desirable. The second answer is that evolutionary psychology is in its infancy, so what researchers present are hypotheses supported by some evidence, not the final word. There is plenty of evidence supporting genetically specified sex differences, but it doesn't account for all of the data, and culture has a large effect too. Third, even if we knew everything about our evolutionary predispositions, which we do not, it would be undesirable or impossible to specify a society based upon them. Just to take the example of rape, it may be in the evolutionary interest of some men to rape, but it is hardly in the evolutionary interest of the woman, nor is it in the interest of her partner, her parents, or her children. So, is evolutionary psychology politically incorrect? In many respects, the question makes no sense. Science is not or shouldn't be political. There are two kinds of science: good science, in which hypotheses are rigorously and dispassionately evaluated against the best evidence available and conclusions tentatively drawn, and bad science, which fails on any or all of the above. If the science is good, disliking the results will not make them any less true. Despite all the argument and debate, many psychologists are convinced that evolutionary psychology has a great deal to offer in the attempt to understand how the mind works. As we argued above, reductionism is a useful process, but we need to be aware that we cannot explain everything by appealing to Darwinism. The majority of research psychologists in the world are focused on proximate questions, such as how children learn to read or how the mind changes as we get older, to name but two. Evolutionary psychology and the logic that it brings will help answer some fascinating questions and present to us an entirely new set of questions that psychologists need to answer. Thanks for joining us. See you next time.